So this morning we had a lot of really inspirational high-level talks. I'm going to kick up the excitement a notch with some ebook format stuff. But the problem I'm really going to try to address is this one. These are all my children. These are all the devices I have in my house as part of my business for trying to make ebooks look as good as they can, to advise publishers on how to do formatting in the most straightforward but platform-independent way. And that, that's not even all of them. There's computers, there's things that haven't come out yet. I don't want people to see piles of devices like this and get incredibly scared. Think, like, how could we possibly know what all these things can do? How can we staff up to managing this proliferation of devices, which are going to be big and small and sizes we don't know yet, form factors that haven't come out yet. So I'm going to try to simplify things a little. Instead of thinking about these devices and panicking every time Kobo announces a new thing that's going to come out, I want to talk a little bit about thinking about reading engines. And this is a little low level for the way publishers are used to thinking about ebooks, but I think it's going to simplify and calm people down, because the problem is not actually as scary as it looks. A reading engine is the piece of code in any kind of e-reading software system that does the work of putting that text on the screen. There's all kinds of other things that go into making e-reading software, like what browses the table of contents and how you move from page to page or chapter to chapter. There's this just low-level piece that's where does the text fall on the screen? Is it scrolling or paginated? This is what I'm going to talk about as the reading engine. And it turns out that because software developers are pretty lazy, there aren't that many different kinds of reading engines. You can collapse down all of these devices into, well, I'm going to say just two categories. And of course, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but it's really not too bad. And because this is an ePub talk, we don't have to worry about the Kindle ecosystem because that's Moby Pocket and we're not going to deal with it. But we're looking at ePub. So the system that you're probably used to seeing when you're working with digital books is people will look at Adobe Digital Editions as the software, but under the hood, and again, simplifying a little, what you're really looking at is this product that Adobe has called the Reader Mobile SDK. And when a new device maker wants to have an e-reading system, and particularly when it's a hardware thing, they go to Adobe, they say, we want the stuff. Adobe says, here. You get the reading engine, and you also get their DRM system. So, every time you try to open digital editions and it tells you want to reinstall, like, yes, okay. Ultimately, you're going to get the mobile SDK. And it's this interface that we're all familiar with. It can be columns or not. And it's the same, and it's tied in with their DRM. This is sort of their offering, that you, as a device maker, can buy into their ecosystem of DRM with Content Server 4, and you kind of get this reading system for free, so you don't have to spend all that time figuring out how to put text on a screen. So what's sort of nice about this from the perspective of both a device maker and a publisher is that you get a kind of consistency across these platforms. And you get some nice features like some multimedia via Flash. You can expect how it's going to look on a variety of devices. Adobe's extended ePub in some ways that are good or bad to do some more complex stuff than is in the ePub standard. But then there's some drawbacks. With this closed ecosystem, they've kind of reinvented the wheel by having to start over with how do you render HTML, how do you support CSS. When you start over with something, you're going to introduce some bugs that may have already been worked out in other systems. So I'm going to talk mostly the rest of the time about how to work with what Adobe has, because they're the market leader right now, but looking forward to where I think we're going to see ePub rendering systems moving on. So I have this book that I like to use every time a new reading system comes out. It's like a mobile SDK sniffer. And there's some bugs that are just consistent that show up in every device. So that's Adobe Digital Editions on the left, that's the Nook in the middle, and then the Sony e-reading software that you install on your desktop if you buy a Sony e-reader. That's not supposed to be like crazy poetry. It's supposed to just be a nice quotation block, and it gets a little scrambled. So you can see that it's all the same software kind of under the hood, despite the fact that everything is branded differently. It's Sony or the Nook. And in fact, there's like almost every hardware device is using this Reader mobile SDK. And I ran up and talked to Michael right after his talk, and he confirmed that that hardware device that they've just released is also using this. So most of the time, if you're looking at a licensed, branded hardware device and some desktop software, you don't have to really worry, is it a Nook, is it a Cooler, is it the Kobo thing? It's going to look the same. The other one, and the one I'm going to argue is kind of where you should be looking ahead, is called WebKit. Now, WebKit is not an e-reading system. It's a browser engine. And if you use a Mac or you have an iPhone, you've used WebKit. It's an open source package that Apple released a few years ago that is now kind of almost the de facto standard for what the reading system, the rendering engine for HTML that's bundled in every new browser. So it's in Safari 4. When you open Safari 4, you're basically just using WebKit. Same thing with Google Chrome. But increasingly where it's really taken off is in the mobile space. So the browser on your iPhone, the browser on the iPad, the browser in Android, the browser in these are all WebKit. So as a web developer, that's awesome because like finally we have this one thing that we know is widely deployed, but unlike Internet Explorer, it's up to date, it's modern, it's being improved all the time, it's got some really cool whiz-bang features. It's one of the things that's going to make the iPad such a success in terms of its multimedia capability because it's got this browser engine. And all these other device makers are kind of jumping on that same bandwagon. If you have a BlackBerry, you know, its browser is just kind of meh, but they've released at least some demos of their next generation browser being WebKit. And what that means for the e-reader space is that since ePub is just HTML and CSS, that most of the time, if you're working in a platform that's already got a browser somehow available, people choose WebKit as the implementation for that, for those e-reading systems. So Stanza uses WebKit. Aldico on the Android platform is WebKit. The Kobo reader in all of the platforms other than the e-ink device is WebKit. I don't know this for sure, but I will bet $1 bazillion that the iPad iBooks application is WebKit. I'm just sure of it. And the application that we launched, the web HTML5 reader, IBIS reader, also uses WebKit because WebKit supports HTML5, which is this kind of next generation of HTML and CSS, and there's some specific implications there for ebooks that I'll talk about. Then you can get these kind of crazy hybrids. This is the Spring something Alex. It's another one that's just come out. It's got both an e-ink screen and a full Android operating system on the bottom. So it's kind of like this mullet of e-readers with the business up front and the like party in the back. So you've got this very consistent Adobe DRM-friendly interface at the top, but you could have kind of any reading system operating at the bottom. There's other, just kind of like Kobo now, you get these weird situations where like you might have the same, what you might think is the same ecosystem, actually licensing different technologies under the hood. So the same book in the Nook device is obviously Adobe's mobile SDK, but on their desktop reader, I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure that's WebKit, and so you can see the book the way it's supposed to look. So what's nice about this is that instead of worrying about designing for all of these different devices, you can simplify your ebook strategy, at least in the ePub space, down to thinking about these two reading engines. And I think that is going to help people tackle some of these problems with making better ebooks, since, as Michael said, it's really time for ebook quality to kind of step up to the plate. This makes that problem a little bit tractable. So I said earlier that Adobe's got these extensions, and some of what they've done are kind of nice things you can do to like specify aspects of the reading environment in their space that you can't do in the ePub. And you can use those extensions to kind of fix problems that you might discover in digital editions and not make your ebooks have problems in other environments, especially these WebKit-related ones. So for example, if you've used InDesign to make an ePub book, then you take that ePub and you crack it open and you look at what's inside. Usually you'll find this file called pagetemplates.xpgt. It uses a fairly difficult to understand system called FO. It's an XML standard for describing how pages flow. It's really meant for paged media, like print media. And Adobe uses that to do some things that you can't say in ePub, like this particular book really wants to be 2 columns, but only if it's of a certain width. It can specify things about page breaking that is either expressed differently in ePub or can't be expressed. And the nice thing about page template, it's a difficult thing to learn to do by hand, and there's not great documentation other than this one blog post that Adobe has put up. But you can do some pretty advanced things, and it's this little sandbox you can play in that has no effect on the rest of the ePub world. So if you don't like the way your book looks in digital editions when you open it up, but you do like the way it looks on the iPad, then you can fix it just in that one place and not turn out that when you now have made some changes in the CSS and you look in the iPad, it's like, oh man, now it looks crappy there. And this is a problem that if you're a web developer, you get very familiar with. You fix bugs in one place and they cause new ones in another browser. So it's kind of nice that you have this little space to play in. There's one of my biggest gripes with the Adobe landscape in e-reading is that you'll know this if you've ever tried it, if you don't specify a font in your ebook and you've got any kind of funny character in it that's like not straight English, there's no font support for it, you get little question marks. So you pretty much, in the Adobe world, always have to embed a font. And I always recommend that you just routinely embed an open source font. There's lots of them. They look good on screens. That's what they're designed for. They're not meant to convey any particular kind of style, but they look nice. And if you do that routinely in all your ePubs, you don't have to worry about whether this particular title has some characters in it and find that out after it got it into the supply chain. You just do this in advance, and you're good to go. It makes the ePub file just a little bit bigger. In WebKit, this is not a problem because WebKit is fully internationalized, and every device these days has fonts in just about every major language. But it doesn't hurt. And there's a blog post on our site that has some instructions on how to do that if you want to embed a font by hand. But there are some things that you can do in the Adobe space that I think are detrimental to the long-term viability of those particular books. So in InDesign, again, there's usually a little checkbox that'll let you embed a font and perform font obfuscation, which is this method to handle some of the licensing issues that are tangled up in fonts about where you might be allowed to embed the font, but the font has to be like stuck into the book so that a person can't just take that font and drag it into their system and start using it. And there's nothing wrong with font obfuscation as a method to deal with licensing. It's just that there's 2 different methods to do it. Only Adobe's is supported, and no one else knows how to read it. And I don't know, for example, in what iBooks is going to do in terms of dealing with fonts that may be obfuscated. So if you're dealing with an open source font only, and you aren't trying to embed a font for stylistic reasons, which is kind of a fool's errand because you don't know that that font is really going to convey the look and feel that you want on a small device versus a big device. You really should just kind of avoid this feature. There's tiny little bugs that just drive me insane that happen to be in ADE, and I see people work around them. This particular example is that ADE will only display the first author in the ePub metadata up in the little left-hand corner. So instead of properly formatting lists of authors as different elements in the book, people stuff them all into one. And that's down the line, that's a problem. It's just wrong. It's bad metadata, and we know that metadata needs to be better. And you're kind of like shorting all the other authors of that book in giving them their own metadata field that might be used for searching or discovery of other books that they've written. Another problem that I'm kind of hoping is going to go away is this idea about mapping from a printed original to an ebook. And Adobe's method isn't part of the spec. There is a spec-friendly way to do this kind of mapping, but again, it's under-supported. So I'm hoping in general that people move away from the idea that the ebook has to have such a direct tie to the print counterpart. I know that can be important in some educational contexts, but I think you need to be thoughtful about whether that's really important for this particular book. In trade fiction, I just don't see that it provides any value. So I advise avoiding that kind of thing. Now, looking ahead, the nice thing about an ecosystem that's built on something like a browser, like WebKit, is that those guidelines for how to do a good digital book are pretty well established because the web community has already worked this out. But some particular things that are more critical in books than are in the general web community, for example, is you should be thoughtful about what aspects of the design of the book are semantic, meaning they're key to understanding the text, versus finding yourself trying to replicate the look of the print book in an ebook context where, with reflowable text, you're not sure what the end result is going to be. So for example, if in the printed book there was a nice dramatic space between the chapter name and the start of the text, if you replicate that spacing, a user on a small device might just not see the start of the content for like 2 pages. It would just look broken and bizarre. But then I've also seen some books where the automatic translation meant that things like scene changes or time differences between one moment and the next weren't captured in the style, and that makes the book actually difficult to follow. You've lost the intent of the author. So if you approach book styling from that, by thinking about preserving the meaning of the text more than the layout of the print, that's a kind of future-forward, safe approach. There's some sort of minor details that I think now that there have been a lot of ebooks out in the market, and readers in particular, that we can start to safely give some guidelines. One, this is a pretty CSS-specific thing, but you're better off using padding to move things around rather than margin. Margin is meant to talk about the boundary outside of the content, and padding is spacing that happens within the boundary of the content. And you'll get the best results if you think about the styling of the book as something that you imagine you only have access to the text. You can't talk about what happens outside of it. You can't talk about like the spacing between the edge of the device and the start of the text. You can do that, but the problem is that you're going to then put that content on some reader, some reading system, that may have made its own choices about how far the spacing should be before the text begins and the device ends. So like, for example, on a small phone, you actually want margins that are pretty tiny because you want to put as many words on the line as you can. If the user bumps up the font size, you don't want them basically reading 1 word per line because you have these big fat margins. So if you use padding, for one thing, the reading systems probably won't stomp on it the way that they may stomp on margin, because those of us who work on devices that are pretty small, when we design them, we really are trying to be aggressive about putting as much text on that small screen. And again, one of those things you can do with the page template thing is describe the margins of the page only in Adobe context. And that's nice because, as you probably have seen, Adobe Digital Editions has pretty narrow margins by default and usually makes people want to make them wider. So you can use their extensions to solve that problem and then not affect the small reading systems that want a narrower margin. So instead of thinking about like how many different devices do I need to buy, how many do I need to test, I want you to think about kind of approaching it from this generic sense. Test in one thing that is in the Adobe ecosystem, test in a big WebKit, like a full-size browser, and test in a small WebKit, mainly a smartphone. And when we get to the problems about multimedia, then things get a little complicated because, is this a time check or just or we're just slowly dying? It's not time? Okay. I've just set the mood. So then there's this issue where if you'd asked me just a couple of months ago, like, I want to put video in a book, what approach should I use? I would say, well, you don't get video on e-ink devices because it doesn't work. You don't currently get video on most smartphone e-readers because it just doesn't happen to work. But you can get video in Adobe Digital Editions, and they support Flash. So I would have said go with Flash. But now we have the iPad, and that doesn't have Flash. It's not going to. This is a war that they're going to fight out at the corporate level. But instead, what it has is HTML5. And the players who I would put smart money on kind of winning this battle for multimedia on mobile devices would be Google and Apple. And if you're going to try to mitigate your risk and think about what kinds of enhanced ebooks might stick around more than just the next quarter, I would say look to these market leaders rather than Flash. This isn't a decided thing, but it's just kind of where I feel that things are going. So my strategy that I'm going to be advising people going forward is, of course, you have to pay attention to the Adobe ecosystem. It just totally dominates these devices. It's not something that I'm saying like that's all over with, forget it, there's a new shiny thing. But it may not be the future direction of the new devices that are going to come out. There's some really simple reasons. One thing, Adobe stuff costs money, and WebKit is free. And Android is free, and Android has WebKit. So I think the devices we're going to see moving forward, especially now that e-ink may be kind of reaching its sunset, are going to be this more browser-centric experience built on WebKit or something like it. So I would suggest that you start exploring working with web designers. There are huge amounts of talent out there that know CSS and HTML and how it behaves in a web context. And I have the feeling that after the iPad comes out, that's the direction that people are going to want to move in terms of enhanced ebooks and even nice text-based ebooks. So thanks. I can take questions now. If we have time for questions, I can take some. Question was, is ePub moving towards incorporating some of this web stuff? And I think HTML5 in particular is kind of what the interesting thing is. HTML5 is this, right now it's kind of this big catchphrase for a lot of things, but when mostly what people are talking about is video. And the thing that's cool about HTML5 video is that it's very simple. There's a tag, it says video. And you embed a movie in it. You don't need a plugin. You don't need any kind of proprietary technology, depending on what video format you use. But it's super straightforward, and it fits nicely with ePub as just this set of markup. Michael from the IDPF is here. But we definitely want ePub to move in that direction. I think there's a nice match between a fairly straightforward, vendor-agnostic video tag. At the same time, specifications move kind of slowly, so I don't know at what point it will be sanctioned, but just the way things tend to work, I think we're going to see ePub books with HTML5 either directly coming out of the Apple thing or just maybe as a byproduct of it. But in terms of formalizing it, I have the feeling that'll just take time as specs tend to move along. So am I asking, or am I telling people that they should abandon InDesign? No, I actually think InDesign is awesome, and it's been huge for the adoption of ePub. CS5 is coming out very soon. Adobe's been great about talking to to us and other ePub developers to get feedback about how to make the ePub export feature better. I think they're moving in a nice pace in InDesign and not such a great or such a fast pace in the reading engine. Probably there's just a big corporation and their different teams. But I have the feeling that InDesign is going to actually just keep getting better. And they made great strides between CS3 and CS4 in their ePub support. So I think InDesign is an excellent way to get into ebooks, especially for small and mid-sized publishers. The reality is that to get the cleanest ePub books out of that, you have to take an extra step and get into that ePub and maybe make some changes out of what InDesign produced. But InDesign gets you like 95% of the way, and that's just huge. I wish there were more blogs that did cover the kind of nitty-gritty ePub stuff. We certainly try to do a lot of that and at blog.threepress.org. And at least it's not all a one-way conversation. A lot of times I'll write a post that will be like, here's some problem we've tried to solve in ePub, and immediately people will comment and tell me that I was just totally wrong. And it's great to have that dialogue. I don't know of too many other blogs that like really just focus so intently on ePub itself, which is sort of too bad. I know that there's definitely people who want to talk about these things and sort of share code. It's just pretty distributed right now. So why did we decide to go totally no DRM in IBIS Reader? I don't know. I've actually asked this of the Adobe people and just haven't gotten a response yet about whether they do truly force you to use both the reading engine and Content Server 4 for DRM. I suspect that you can probably license them separately. It's just that most people don't. For me, the big issue is just portability. So it seemed for a little while that Adobe DRM was the standard DRM for ePub, and that meant that if you bought into this system, you could get this kind of like Kobo dream of being able to move your book in all different devices. And Apple's really kind of shot that down a little. It's forcing people who want to have a Kobo approach to implement a million different e-readers on different devices. So you'll be able to read your Kobo books on the iPad, but not because they licensed the RM SDK, but because their poor engineers had to make a version for the iPad that hooks into their cloud. For us as a really small company, that's just way too much overhead. We wanted to just focus on a totally pure web-driven cloud model and just not have to worry about having other players in that ecosystem, and not have to worry about an 8.5-week approval time. Cool. Well, thanks for your time, everybody.